A totally unsurprising study came out recently, which states that 1 out of 4 millennials claims to have precisely 0 friends. Side note, I wonder if they might have enemies though, which then makes me wonder if that puts them in the negative for friends. If you have 0 friends but 5 enemies, do you have -5 friends? Maybe. But then again, if you have 1 true friend and all your enemies are friendless haters, then could their hate really ever equate in any way to a 1 true friend? The last side note wasn't an actual side note. It was actually the segue to our real purpose here, to think about friendship philosophically. Before diving into the history of the idea of friendship, we have to ask, what does it mean to wonder philosophically? Speaking of haters, one recently came up in my comments, of all places, to say it's a good thing none of my subscribers know what philosophy is. Obviously that dignat is wrong, but just in case some people were wondering how I'm using the term, let's just say it this way. Philosophy is not the love of wisdom, wonder, rationality, truth, justice, or beauty that philosophy nerds like to claim it is. Philosophy is also not the thing every person is doing when pondering out the window. Deep in thought. And that's not necessarily philosophical thinking. Okay, so then, well, what is it? Well, for some people, it's the process of acquiring as many true beliefs and as few false beliefs as possible. But that assumes a certain prioritization of truth over other aspects of life. The thing is that philosophy for you could be about the quality of your consciousness, of your experience of life. You know, it doesn't have to be one that prioritizes epistemology, which is to say theories of knowledge and how you know what you know and stuff like that. And that is often how the YouTube skeptics treat it. Like they act like that is the purpose of philosophy. It's one of the purposes of philosophy, but we could also say that philosophy is, in a certain sense, part of its process is working out internal contradictions that we didn't even know we believed. Mutually exclusive beliefs or practices that are contradictory, and well, we live in cognitive dissonance so long as we internalize them. And so philosophy can be a way of sorting oneself out. For a more categorical approach, there are the systematizers or conceptual analysts. Systematizers find new ways of synthesizing different discourses to better understand the world they live in. What is this synthesizing different discourses, you might ask? Well, biology is a discourse, literature is a discourse. I mean, fields are discursive. They are basically a long-form conversation that doesn't end within one lifespan, but spills over throughout hundreds, if not thousands of years. These are conversations that you can just go deeper and deeper into your whole life. Yeah, there are systematizers who try to find ways to bring them all into accordance, or to conceptually make sense of where we are historically at with our levels of understanding, considering all of the different fields, right? Right now, obviously that's going to be pretty difficult because there are so many, but systematizers, they never give up, and they just keep trying to come up with more and more ingenious meta ways of doing their work. And so we have plenty of them still today, though conceptual analysts are a lot more popular in the United States especially. Conceptual analysts pick apart the meaning of words until they're generally useless, though perhaps theoretically pure enough for scientists or logicians. During my studies, I have primarily trained in the conceptual analysis tradition, but my interests in the overall slant of theory plebe content in general is with the systematizers. Today, though, we're taking a different route, which is the third option, the history of ideas. That's right. If you ever do decide to enroll in a philosophy class, and if you pay attention to the way your professor constructs and teaches the course, you should be able to tell pretty soon if they are primarily a conceptual analyst, systematizer, or history of ideas buff. Before we dive into the history of ideas about friendship, To be clear, just because my interest generally inhabits the turf of systematizers doesn't mean I don't acknowledge all three modes have their own roles to play. It really is too bad when entire departments dedicated to philosophy choose one of these three modes at the expense of the others. In reality, humans are much messier than the classification methods we use to try to understand them, so any given person will typically prove to be some combination of these categories. Anyway, the reason we need history of ideas buffs is so we can see the way phenomena such as friendship are interpreted and passed on through time. Why? Because the ideas we think are our own are all basically watered down ideas that have essentially trickled down from the heights achieved by various thinkers at different moments in history. Or were these great thinkers only really great because they said what everyone else was thinking, but they put it in better terms? Or was it the opposite, that they said what nobody was thinking, but suddenly couldn't get out of their heads after learning? Incredulous wonka these grand theories of how ideas trickle down, the one thing we can be certain of is this. When studying the ancients, we are almost always struck by how some of their observations have either continued to get reproduced up to our current day, or we're astonished by how little humans have changed. In terms of known... side note, when it comes to great thinkers and great texts that form the kind of backbone consciousness of culture, I'm using obviously pretty Eurocentric thinkers, texts, and criteria for evaluating and judging such things. There's philosophy in its various forms in every culture, but there's a pretty sophisticated version in the European Western tradition. That starts in ancient Athens and moves on up through Rome, the Christian church, and then the break from that through the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, and into modernity, and then there's, science and stuff like that. So I just want to say that what makes a great thinker or a great text great is just the fact that they are worth dedicating your entire life to studying. And we know they're worth it because people keep alive the dead. If the dead is worth keeping alive for one person, then they're obviously great. If the dead are worth keeping alive for a lot of people, then they're clearly really great. But if each of the greats of every era, long after they're dead, we look back and they were truly impacted by the other greats of previous eras, then they're really great. So there's a sort of like chain of people pointing at other people being like, this person's worth keeping alive because gosh, I just can't argue with X, Y, and Z things they're saying, but also A, B, and C things that they're saying are utter hogwash and need to be dispelled from our culture, and therefore engaging critically with this person's work is a worthwhile task that will be beneficial for everyone. And then if you do a good enough job at that, then other people are like, wow, I need to reference that. Oh my gosh, every time I read your book, I just keep coming back to it. I could read this forever. That's a great text. That's a great thinker. Anyway, in terms of known human history, Aristotle was by all counts the greatest systematizer, only ever matched by his literal reincarnations Aquinas or Hegel. Okay, and if you do not believe me, just consider the fact that he wrote the book on metaphysics, he wrote the book on logic, he wrote the book on rhetoric, he wrote the book on poetics, he wrote the book on theater, he wrote the book on politics, he wrote the book on basically everything. He came up with an amazing system, and it's an absolute tragedy that we only have pieces of it today. In a certain sense, he's the first real philosopher. Socrates was the philosopher who is kind of like Jesus, who went around never writing anything down. Same with Buddha. Other disciples are the ones who wrote it down. And, Plato was the one who wrote down the stories about Socrates. And he was I think a true philosopher. He had a philosophy but it's hard to separate Socrates from Plato. Aristotle's the first person who came along and tried to do things in the most scientific and systematic way yet. And kind of wrote the book on everything. And It's those separations between things like poetics and rhetoric, the separations between metaphysics and natural science, that were the real beginning of, well, the forms of comprehension and analysis that are taken seriously today. The kind that provide a systematic comprehension of the world. Now, Aristotle, pretty cool. He was fine with slaves, but that's going to be a repeated theme throughout the history of ideas. Yeah, he wasn't a good guy. I'm not saying he's a good guy. I'm just saying he was genius. But using thinkers in discourses is never an endorsement. Okay, being a genius doesn't mean I'd like you. It just means I have something to learn from you. Aristotle said that friends are either for utility, fun, or learning. The last kind of friend is more of what we call mentorship today. Fun friends are obvious to us because we basically can't cut loose without them. Then there's friends for utility, which means the people who come to make sure your electrical and gas hookups are safe and in working order. Utility is just a word for usefulness. Useful friends are those friends everyone exploits because they have a truck and can help move when your fun friends flaked because they're too hungover. But can you really call a person a friend if they're only good for partying? Funnily enough, most people would probably say yes, while pushing back significantly harder against the idea that you can use somebody for their truck and call that friendship. Thanks to Kant, who Aristotle never had the chance of meeting until his Hegel form, it's typically seen as unethical to use people. Or at least, as he put it, you can't have a harmonious society worth living in if everybody treats one another primarily as means or use values for their own satisfaction. Kant, more like Marx, am I right? Instead, Kant argues that generalized well-being in society can only flourish if we treat one another as their own ends first. So while you might be able to help me with this, and I thou with that, we can't forget that the other person in every relationship also has their own life with its own values and goals that must be respected. This is the basis of human dignity. But we've jumped ahead. While Kant provides a rigorous and systematic overarching theory for why we can't treat people primarily as means, it was actually Seneca, roughly 450 years after Aristotle, who first broke with this Aristotelian doctrine. Not only are friends ride-or-die homies, but Seneca went on to trash talk Aristotle's idea that a friend can be a friend just for use.
One who begins to be your friend because it pays will also cease because it pays.
So friends for clout, friends for climbing ladders, and friends for image in general are not real friends. Well, that's about 90% of people under capitalism, so are these impossible standards to hold friends to? Perfectionist or idealist definitions might prove useless now in the age of the Facebook friend and all the casual ambiguity that brings. Was Seneca just some radical, or did other Stoics also care about friendship this much? Let's ask his teacher.
The necessity of circumstances when the going gets rough proves friends and detects enemies. In prosperity, it is very easy to find a friend, but in adversity, it is the most difficult of all things.
Wow. It's like they were talking about fair weather friends 2,000 years ago.
He who regards himself only and enters upon friendships for this reason reckons wrongly. These are the so-called fair weather friendships. One who is chosen for the sake of utility will be satisfactory only so long as he is useful.
So does fair weather friend literally go back all the way to Seneca, or is that a translation? Is it like a direct translation of the Latin, and that's where we got fair weather friends, or is that just like a rough equivalent to some figure of speech that Seneca was using, and something that we could obviously find more relatable? I'm no expert on such things. If you know, go ahead and let us know in the comments. If you cite your sources, I'll pin it to the top of the comments. Either way, is it not a little strange that Seneca and Epictetus seem to take friendship so seriously? I mean, what's with these people? They're so hardcore about friendship. Seneca literally said,
"If you consider any man a friend whom you do not trust as you trust yourself, you are mightily mistaken, and you do not sufficiently understand what true friendship means. When friendship is settled, you must trust, Before friendship is formed, you must pass judgment. Ponder for a long time whether you shall admit a given person to your friendship. But when you have decided to admit him, welcome him with all your heart and soul. Speak as boldly with him as with yourself. Regard him as loyal, and you will make him loyal.
Yeah, if you think that this is hardcore, they get worse.
For what purpose then do I make a man my friend? In order to have someone for whom I may die, whom I may follow into exile, against whose death I may stake my own life and pay the pledge too.
What can I say but hardcore? Setting aside systemic speculations, homoeroticism, and politics, the three things we have to seriously unpack to even broach this in an academically responsible manner, let's just make an egregious simplification about Rome and say that at its height, life was pretty intense and beyond any one person's ability to know anything, much less to effect serious change. Stoicism is usually introduced at this point in a 101 course as a popular Roman response to the immense alienation and smallness felt by little human beings in big, complex, and highly exploitative societies. What was Stoicism again? Stoicism teaches that at the base level, everything sucks, and that if you don't learn to accept that, then you'll never be able to accept yourself or your society, because you suck, and so does your society. To quote Epictetus,
"You suck ass, losers."
What does this old ass elitist have to teach me, though, you wonder, in your privileged position as a not slave? That's right, Epictetus was a slave. He also said,
"Suck it up, fools. The more you try to control others, the more miserable you'll be."
If everything is suffering, and suffering is only compounded by fixation on things beyond your control, then it makes sense to say you need to focus on those things you can control, such as emotions, thoughts, exercise, and cleaning your damn room. I mean, he was literally Jordan Peterson for Rome, minus the New Age spin on Ayn Rand. Or the fact that he would have never lived a life in protest to SJWs because he would have warned Peterson that doing so would be miserable. We can't move on from explaining who Epictetus was, though, without pointing out that not only was he a slave who managed to win his freedom because of the genius of his teachings, but he also radically impacted others such as Seneca, who was advisor to Emperor Nero, until Nero decided to have him offed.
No! You threw off my groove!
I'm sorry, but you've thrown off the Emperor's groove.
Similarly, Epictetus was secretly referred to as Master by Marcus Aurelius. Emperor Aurelius, as featured poorly in Gladiator.
"You're false as a son is my failure as a father."
How was it that a slave, an advisor to a tyrant, and an actual emperor, all three found a practical life philosophy in Stoicism? When people feel like pawns to a bigger system they can't ultimately control. When people are at the fundamental level merely means to the use of power's interest, then yeah, nothing is as empowering as suddenly choosing to stop focusing on the stuff you can't control. Stoicism, in a sense, is this reaction, a response to uncertainty and complexity. It says, don't worry about your reputation. Don't worry about those things like the society that you live in, whether it's an empire, whether it's capitalist, whether it's whatever it is. Don't worry about those things that you cannot control. Don't worry about the thoughts and opinions of others. Just focus on your own thoughts and feelings. Focus on your own habits. But at the same time, then it does this, comes out of left field, and it's like, but friendship matters. Not only does it matter, but it's serious business. Stoic became almost a slur for people who are fundamentalists about focusing on their own problems while neglecting everything they don't have sovereign control over. Yet they cared about friendship so much. Perhaps in a world where complexity is only increasing, we could also learn to prioritize friendships. Wait, seriously? How's this helpful to us now, though, in the age of Facebook friends? In the age of the distraction economy and the gamification of social clout on capitalist platforms, when alliances form around the consumption and expression of signifiers without reference, when really instead of communities, we're in validation gangs, consumer demographics, an age of spectacle, simulation, and simulacra. And who says Epictetus's philosophy caught on because it works, when in reality this philosophy of relative improvement within your societally assigned role doesn't actually challenge the existing structure in any serious way? Doesn't this philosophy of friendship just support power by committing to uncritically support friendships that are themselves political? When Seneca says you should go into exile with a friend or die with your homies, we have to remember that he was a statesman writing for fellow rulers. What about if the existing social order threatens the short and long-term existence of our planet? What about if the existing social order erases you, actively impeding your ability to live a free and meaningful life? And wasn't this all supposed to be relevant to us only because these are ideas that seem to have been handed down to us? Like, we all have this basic notion now that friendship is really important. What about the fact that equally, if not more popular philosophies of friendship came about in modernity that entirely contradict the ride or die commitment ethos? For instance, C.S. Lewis is very popular in the US, and he says that of the 4 types of love, the friendship type is really the least necessary, the least essential, that it's basically the one used to kill time, to have a buddy to go golfing with. How do we live in a society torn between ride or die and casually non-essential? Does this just leave us in an ambiguous zone of conflicted beliefs? These are just a few of the many questions that we will be exploring in this series on friendship, philosophy, and critical theory. If you're interested, if you like this essay, if you're interested in the future essays that I'm working on right now, and you want to see those, make sure to not only subscribe, but click the little bell beside the subscribe option so that you get notifications when those new video essays do go up. And if those questions are not the only questions that are coming up for you when you're thinking about all of this, if you've got more questions to add, or if you've got references, resources that you'd like to share with me, for instance, like I didn't know that 1 out of 4 millennials claims to not have a friend. That was something that a friend told me. So if you've got references and resources that you want me to take into account, maybe, factor into my study, then do it. Send it my way. Comment below. Let me know your questions, your considerations, and those will be incorporated into future essays because unlike bigger channels, you have a way greater ability to influence smaller creators and to be a part of the ongoing dialogue and exploration of the ideas that this channel is even considering in the first place. So thank you. Thank you for making this possible. And if you want to encourage me, you can always tip me with a one-time donation through PayPal or become a monthly supporter on my Patreon, like these amazing people whose names are scrolling past right now. So thank you. Leave a thumbs up if you think that you'd like to see more content like this, and a thumbs down if you are a friendless hater. Goodbye. Like, follow, subscribe.